Have you ever had the feeling that something was trying to communicate with you, but in a way that no one else notices? That's exactly how I felt when I started noticing strange patterns in the headlines of a local newspaper. Loose words, misplaced phrases, messages that seemed to whisper secrets between the lines. At first, I thought it was a coincidence. But coincidence is the name we give to what we don't yet understand. Each edition seemed to carry a disguised warning. Small clues that, days later, revealed themselves as announcements of real crimes. As if someone were using the newspaper to predict, or worse, announce what was to come. And when I realized that these messages were becoming increasingly personal, I understood that it wasn't just an investigation. It was a game, and I was already in it. The case you're about to follow isn't about physical evidence or eyewitnesses. It's about logic enigmas and a mind that seems to operate outside of time. A mind that writes stories before they happen. And if you think that's impossible, maybe you're reading the wrong newspaper. Or maybe you haven't yet learned to see what's hidden in plain sight. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching this video from? I want to know if I've been around here before, investigating something you might not even know was happening. Because when mystery chooses a place, it usually leaves traces. I've never been one to believe in coincidences. In my profession, they're usually just shortcuts to the truth or well-disguised traps. It all started on an ordinary morning, bitter coffee and newspaper in hand, when a headline made me frown. Summer storm causes blackout in upscale neighborhood. Nothing out of the ordinary, right? 3 days later, a brutal murder happens right there, during a blackout. At first, I thought it was just an unfortunate coincidence. But when another crime occurred, also discreetly announced in a footnote days before, something inside me clicked. I started rereading old editions, like someone looking for errors in an already assembled puzzle. And that's when I realized there was a pattern. Loose words, misplaced phrases, hidden messages, as if someone were playing with time. The newspaper seemed to know too much. It wasn't just weather forecasts or local politics. It was as if each edition carried a warning, a whisper disguised as news. And the more I read, the more I felt that those messages weren't for just anyone. They were for me. As if someone was testing me, provoking me, inviting me to a game I didn't know I was playing. It was at that moment that I stopped being just a reader. I became a hunter. And the newspaper, my map. But maps can also be traps, and I was about to discover that some clues don't want to be found, they want to be followed. And when you follow a clue you don't understand, what you find in the end may not be what you expected. The City Courier wasn't just a newspaper, it was an institution. Founded over 80 years ago, it survived governments, crises, and even mysterious fires. I grew up watching my father leaf through its pages with reverence, as if they were sacred. But in recent months, something had changed. The articles were shorter, stranger. And some seemed written by someone who knew too much about the city's inner workings. I went to the newspaper's headquarters, an old building that smelled of old paper and stale coffee. The receptionist looked at me as if I were just another curious visitor. But as soon as I mentioned the suspicious articles, she fell silent. These columns. Nobody knows who writes them, she said, almost whispering. According to her, the texts appeared in the system already completed, without any registered authorship, as if they were sent by someone who doesn't exist. I spoke with the editor-in-chief, a weary man with eyes that had seen more than they should. He told me that about a year ago, ghost articles began to appear, texts that no one on the team would claim to have written. They tried to trace the origin, but the files came from an external, encrypted server. The only thing they knew was that these articles always contained something strange, something that seemed to predict the future. I left there with an uneasy feeling. The newspaper that once informed now seemed to manipulate. What if someone was using that structure to send coded messages? Messages that only a few could understand? The idea seemed absurd, but also familiar. Because, deep down, I knew I'd seen something similar before. I just couldn't remember where. It was in a Sunday edition that I noticed something strange. The main headline was about a craft fair, but certain words were in bold for no apparent reason. Silence, shadow, fall, time. Loose words, but which, together, seemed to form a sentence. I picked up a pen and began to circle each one of them, like someone trying to decipher a hastily left note. The phrase that emerged was, "Silence precedes the fall in the time of shadow." Too poetic for an article about ceramics. That wasn't editorial style, it was code. I started comparing it to other editions and realized this pattern repeated itself. Always in seemingly irrelevant articles, hidden among advertisements and footnotes. It was as if someone was trying to communicate without being noticed. I decided to create a timeline with all the phrases I found. Each one seemed to announce something that would happen days later. A fire, a disappearance, even a political scandal. It was as if the newspaper were a modern oracle, disguised as routine. But who was behind these messages? And why did they choose me as a reader? With each new edition, I felt I was being guided, not by obvious clues, but by fragments of logic hidden amidst the chaos of information. And the deeper I delved, the more I felt that this wasn't just a game, it was an invitation. An invitation to enter a world where the truth isn't revealed, it's hidden. And I was about to accept. I've never been the type of investigator to get carried away by far-fetched theories. I like facts, logic, things that fit together like pieces of a puzzle. But this case was affecting me in a different way. It was as if I was being challenged by someone who knew my weaknesses. And that, I confess, made me uneasy. I've always had a penchant for puzzles. Since I was a child, I would take apart clocks just to understand how they worked. In academia, while others memorized laws, I studied patterns of behavior. Perhaps that's why I became so involved with this newspaper. It didn't just report crimes, it presented logic, disguised as madness. And I couldn't resist a good mental challenge. But something deeper was happening. I started having strange dreams, as if the newspaper messages were invading my mind. I would wake up with phrases in my head, images I didn't remember seeing. It was as if the case was choosing me, molding me, pulling me into a labyrinth I didn't know if I wanted to leave. And that scared me. More than I admitted. Even so, I continued. Because deep down, I knew it wasn't just about solving crimes. It was about understanding who was behind the curtain. And perhaps understanding myself. Because when you start investigating the invisible, what appears first is what's hidden inside you. And I was about to discover that not everything that is logical is safe. The question that wouldn't leave my head was simple, but disturbing. How could a newspaper predict crimes before they happened? It wasn't just a coincidence, nor a well-placed guess. These were precise, almost intimate details, as if the author of the messages were inside the minds of those involved. Or worse, as if they were shaping events. And that changed everything. I began to consider hypotheses I would normally dismiss. Was it a psychological game? A social experiment? Or someone trying to prove that chaos can be controlled? The idea of a conspiracy began to take shape. And the more I investigated, the more I felt that something or someone was manipulating the city behind the scenes. Like an invisible conductor leading a symphony of tragedies. The most unsettling thing was the feeling that I was part of the plan. The messages seemed to taunt me, as if they knew I would find them. What if all of this was a test? A mental challenge created by someone who wanted to see how far I would go? The line between investigation and obsession began to blur, and I no longer knew if I was hunting or being hunted. But one thing was certain, it wasn't random. There was logic, intention, purpose. And if I wanted to understand what was happening, I would have to dive deeper. Because when the mystery isn't on the surface, it's in the abyss that the answers are found. And I was about to descend another step. The first crime announced was so accurate it kept me awake at night. The headline read, "Blackout hits business district, traffic chaos." 3 days later, during the blackout, a well-known businessman was found dead in his office, locked from the inside. No signs of forced entry, no witnesses. Only silence, shadows, and the fall, exactly as the newspaper had suggested. His name was Alvaro Mendez, owner of a chain of clinics. A methodical, reserved man, with few friends and many enemies. The police treated it as suicide, but something didn't add up. The position of the body, the absence of fingerprints, the clock stopped exactly at 10:22 p.m. Everything seemed staged, as if someone wanted the scene to be interpreted in a specific way. I rummaged through the newspaper archives and found a note published days before talking about the fall of a silent empire. Alvaro was known as the Emperor of Private Healthcare. Coincidence? Not anymore. The message was there, hidden, waiting to be read. And I began to understand that this case wouldn't be solved with ordinary evidence. It required a different kind of interpretation. Alvaro's death was the turning point. It wasn't just a crime, it was a manifesto. Someone was using the newspaper as a stage, as a code, as a weapon. And if I wanted to prevent the next act, I would have to decipher the script before it was staged. Because the newspaper didn't just tell stories. It wrote destinies. I returned to the newspaper's newsroom, this time with less formality and more urgency. I wanted to understand how those messages were being published without anyone noticing. I entered casually, but with my eyes attentive to every detail. The atmosphere was chaotic, like any newsroom. Phones ringing, journalists rushing around, coffee cooling in forgotten cups. But there was something strange in the air. A silent tension. I gained access to the internal system with the help of a technician who must have been in his early 20s and had more curiosity than common sense. He showed me the publication records, and that's when things got even stranger. Some articles appeared in the system without any editing history. No author, no draft, no login. They simply appeared, as if generated by an invisible entity. I asked to see the security camera footage from the editing room. The technician hesitated, but eventually gave in. And what we saw was disturbing. During the times when the phantom stories were inserted, there was no one in the room. No movement, no presence. Just a screen lighting up by itself and the files being saved. It was as if the system itself was being operated by someone who didn't need to be physically there. I left the newsroom with more questions than answers. If someone was manipulating the newspaper, they were doing so with an extraordinary level of access and intelligence. And if that someone didn't want to be found, perhaps they were watching me while I tried to find them. Because in mind games, the first to move isn't always the player. Sometimes it's the pawn. After visiting the newsroom, I began to notice that the strange events weren't limited to the newspaper. My personal computer started malfunctioning, files would disappear, folders would create themselves, and once, an image appeared on my desktop background. A newspaper page with a headline that never existed. It was as if someone was trying to send me a message. Or scare me. I received an unidentified call. On the other end, a distorted voice simply said, "You're reading correctly, but you're not seeing everything yet." Before I could respond, the call dropped. I checked the number, but there was no record. It was as if the call had come out of nowhere. And that made me think, if someone is manipulating the newspaper system, why not manipulate mine too? I started to distrust everything. Lights flashing at specific times, people watching me on the street, and even an envelope left on my apartment door with newspaper clippings and a single handwritten sentence. Time is the editor. This was no longer a common investigation. It was a psychological game, and I was being pushed into the center of it, without knowing who was moving the pieces. The feeling of being watched intensified. And it wasn't paranoia, it was pattern. Everything was connected, as if each strange event were a comma within a larger narrative. And if I wanted to understand what was to come, I would have to accept that logic, in this case, wasn't a straight line. It was a labyrinth. And I was only beginning to explore its corridors. It was in an article about gardening that I found the second clue. A seemingly innocent text about caring for rose bushes contained a sequence of words with swapped letters. Rosa appeared as R0SA, Tara as T3Ra. At first glance, it seemed like a typo. But when it comes to hidden messages, nothing is by chance. I decided to apply a simple substitution code, and the result put me on alert. The decoded message read, "The next cut will be precise. Prepare yourself." There was no signature, no context. But the word cut made me think of something surgical, calculated. And days later, a renowned surgeon was found dead in his clinic, with a perfectly sculpted incision in his chest. No sign of struggle, no cameras working, just silence and precision, exactly as announced. From then on, I began to treat each story like a puzzle. I spent nights analyzing sources, comparing patterns, testing figures. It was as if the newspaper was teaching me a new language, a way of reading that demanded more than just attentive eyes. It required intuition, logic, and a certain dose of madness. Because the more I understood, the more I felt I was being shaped by it. This second clue showed me that the author or authors weren't just predicting crimes. They were narrating a story, chapter by chapter, using the newspaper as a stage and the victims as characters. And if I wanted to prevent the next act, I would have to learn to read between the lines. Because the true text is never where the eyes can see. It's where the mind dares to go. The name that began to emerge in the subtext of the investigation was that of someone I had previously considered just an urban legend. Eduardo Lacerda, a former journalist who disappeared 7 years ago. They said he was brilliant, obsessive, and had a fixation on predictions. Not mystical predictions, but statistics, patterns, algorithms. He believed that everything could be predicted, even human behavior. And perhaps he was trying to prove it. I rummaged through old files and found articles signed by him that seemed more like philosophical essays than news reports. He spoke about the logic of chaos, the mathematics of tragedy, and the newspaper as an instrument of social control. It was as if he were preparing the ground for something bigger. And if he was behind the messages, he wasn't just a criminal. He was an architect, an author of realities. I spoke with colleagues who worked with him. They all said the same thing. Eduardo was brilliant, but unsettling. He had an intense presence, spoke as if he knew more than he should, and lived surrounded by notebooks full of codes and diagrams. One of them told me that shortly before disappearing, Eduardo said he was writing the greatest report in history, one that no one would understand until it was too late. The idea that he was still out there, manipulating events through the newspaper, seemed absurd. But absurd was exactly the word that defined this case. And if Eduardo really was behind the messages, I wasn't dealing with an ordinary criminal. I was facing someone who saw the world as a chessboard. And I, perhaps, was just another piece in his game. It wasn't just the story that consumed me. It was what it was doing to me. I began to doubt my own perception. Sometimes I'd read an article and be sure there was a hidden message, but upon rereading it, everything seemed normal. It was as if the newspaper was playing with my mind, testing me, slowly bending me. And I, no matter how hard I tried to resist, was giving in. I started avoiding conversations with colleagues. I didn't want to seem paranoid, nor admit that I was being emotionally affected. But the truth is, I wasn't sleeping well anymore. I dreamt of headlines that turned into crimes, of words that haunted me. The investigation stopped being a job and became an obsession. And obsessions, I knew well, are dangerous. I started to wonder if I was really in control. Was I following clues? Or being led by them? Each new discovery seemed to push me to a darker place within myself. A place where logic and madness mixed. And the worst part, I was starting to like the feeling. As if the mystery was giving me a purpose I didn't know I needed. It was at that point that I realized the case wasn't just about crimes foretold. It was about me, about what I was willing to sacrifice to understand the inexplicable. And when the investigation starts messing with who you are, there's no way to come out unscathed. Because some answers don't come to clarify, they come to transform. And I was about to be transformed. It was while deciphering a new message that everything became personal. The phrase read, "He who has fallen will fall again." And the name that appeared in the next article made me freeze. Marina Duarte. She had been the victim of a kidnapping years ago, in a case I investigated diligently, but which ended unsolved. Marina survived, but was never the same again. And now, her name was circulating again. As an omen, the article was about an art exhibition where Marina would be present. The text seemed ordinary, but it concealed a sequence of words that, together, formed a warning. The painting will be painted in silence. That hit me like a punch. Marina was an artist, and silence had always been her refuge. It was as if someone was using her pain as part of the enigma, and I couldn't allow her to become a pawn again. I went through the old case files, searching for connections. And I found something that had escaped me at the time, an anonymous letter sent to the police station, with phrases similar to those now appearing in the newspaper. It was as if the author had been at work for years, testing limits, observing reactions. And I, unknowingly, had already crossed his path before. Perhaps he had been watching me all along. This discovery changed everything. The case ceased to be merely a cerebral investigation and became an emotional mission. I needed to protect Marina, but I also needed to understand why she was being used as a symbol. Because when the past resurfaces, it doesn't come alone. And I knew that, by opening this door, other memories would follow. It was on a Tuesday that the newspaper delivered a new message, more direct than all the previous ones. The clock marks the end. 48 hours. The phrase was hidden in an article about traffic, among street names and rush hour information. There was no doubt a new crime was about to happen. And this time, I had a deadline. 48 hours to decipher it, act, and prevent it. The pressure was different. It was no longer about understanding the pattern. It was about saving a life. Every minute seemed to weigh more heavily. I pieced together all the previous clues, trying to find a connection to the new enigma. The article mentioned a specific street, a time, and a reference to steps that don't return. This led me to a bus terminal, where the flow of people was constant and unpredictable. I spent hours observing the place, trying to anticipate what might happen. I talked to drivers, security guards, even street vendors. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but the atmosphere was strange, as if something was about to happen, but nobody knew what. And I, with the clock ticking, felt like I was always one step behind, as if the game's creator was watching me, smiling. With each edition of the newspaper, a new piece of the puzzle was revealed, and I knew that if I didn't decipher everything in time, someone would pay the price. Because this wasn't a guessing game, it was a duel of minds. And when time is the enemy, every second becomes a clue, or a sentence. And I was about to discover which of the two awaited me. It was during a sleepless night, surrounded by piles of newspapers and scribbled codes, that I received a curious message. You are close, but you are reading with your eyes, not your mind. The signature was from someone named Clara, an amateur cryptographer who had been following my investigations for years. She claimed to have noticed the patterns even before I did, but never had any way to prove it. Now, she wanted to help. We met in a discreet coffee shop, where she showed me a notebook full of notes. Clara had a sharp mind, the kind that sees logic where others see chaos. She explained that the newspaper's codes followed a fractal structure. Each message was part of a larger one, like pieces of a mosaic. And more, there was a temporal sequence, as if the crimes were chapters of a hidden narrative. With her help, we managed to decipher a new message before the newspaper was published. It was a prediction of a fire in an abandoned library. We acted quickly, alerted the authorities, and for the first time, managed to avert disaster. It was a small triumph, but enough to prove that we were on the right track, and that, perhaps, we weren't so alone in this hunt. Clara brought something I lacked, lightness. While I was sinking into paranoia, she saw the case as a puzzle to be solved. And that gave me breathing room. Because sometimes what you need isn't more clues. It's someone to remind you why you started. And with Clara by my side, I realized the game was changing. But were we ready for the next move? It was just when we thought we were starting to understand the game that everything turned upside down. Clara found a series of messages that, when deciphered, didn't announce a crime, but described an event that had already happened. A robbery weeks ago that seemed unrelated to the other cases. But the details were so precise that it seemed staged. as if the crime had been committed to fit the prediction. This idea disturbed me. What if the crimes weren't being predicted, but rather planned to appear as predictions? Someone could be using the newspaper as a script, and those involved would simply be actors in a macabre theater. That changed everything. It ceased to be a mystery about hidden messages and became an investigation into large-scale manipulation. And I needed to find out who was directing this spectacle. I began reviewing the cases with this new perspective, and I realized they all had something in common. They were public, high-profile, and involved people with some kind of influence. It was as if the crimes were chosen not for their complexity, but for their impact. And the newspaper, with its massive circulation, was the perfect stage. The question now was, who was writing this script? And why? This twist made me rethink everything. Maybe Eduardo Lacerda wasn't just predicting. Maybe he was orchestrating. What if he wasn't alone? What if there was a group behind it, testing the limits of public perception, manipulating narratives, playing God? The investigation gained a new layer. And I knew that to unravel it, I would have to go beyond logic. I would have to get into the game. With each new discovery, the feeling that there was something bigger behind the crimes grew stronger. Clara found a series of articles that, together, formed a kind of manifesto. They talked about social control, manipulation of perception, and the power of information. They weren't just messages, they were ideologies. And this led us to a disturbing hypothesis. There was a group behind it all, an invisible collective operating in the shadows. This group, it seemed, used the newspaper as a testing tool. They were testing society's ability to react, the police's ability to anticipate, and the media's ability to interpret. It was as if each crime was an experiment, a variable in a silent study of human behavior. And we, the investigators, were just part of the equation. The idea of being used as a guinea pig made me uneasy, but also determined. Clara found records of secret meetings, pseudonyms in old columns, and even cross-references between newspapers from other cities. It was as if this group was spread out, operating as a network, with an objective we still couldn't understand. And if they were testing limits, the next step could be even bolder. Perhaps it wasn't about predicting crimes anymore, but about creating realities. This conspiracy was a game changer. It was no longer about a brilliant criminal. It was about a structure, an invisible cog that turned silently, shaping events, manipulating narratives. And if we wanted to dismantle it, we would have to go beyond the investigation. We would have to understand the system, because when the enemy is invisible, the only weapon left is to see what no one else sees. The special edition of the newspaper arrived unannounced. Wrapped in black plastic, no logo, no date. Just a phrase printed on the cover. The last enigma is you. My heart raced. I opened it carefully, like someone disarming a bomb. Inside, a single article, no title, no author. And in it, a detailed description of a solitary investigator, obsessed with hidden messages, on the verge of disappearing. Each line seemed written with intimate knowledge of my routine, my schedule, my habits, even the thoughts I never shared with anyone. It was as if someone had been observing me for months or years. The article ended with a prediction. On Friday night, silence will fall upon the man who reads too much. Was it a threat? A warning? Or just another piece of the puzzle? Clara tried to convince me it was a provocation, a way to destabilize me. But I knew I couldn't ignore it. I spent Friday on high alert, every step calculated, every shadow observed. And when night fell, silence came, but not as I expected. A blackout hit my neighborhood, exactly at 10:22 p.m., the same time as the first victim. Coincidence? Not anymore. I stood there in the dark, newspaper in hand, feeling that the game was coming to an end. But was it really the end? Or just the beginning of a new phase? Because when the enigma turns against the investigator, everything changes. And I knew that, from then on, it wasn't enough to decipher messages. I would have to decipher myself, and, perhaps, discover who was really writing this story. The night after the blackout, I received an anonymous message with an address and a time. Clara insisted I not go alone, but something told me that this meeting needed to be mine. I arrived at the location, an old abandoned warehouse, and found a projector on, displaying old headlines, all the ones I had deciphered. And in the center of the room, an empty chair with an envelope on it. Inside, a handwritten letter. The handwriting was familiar. Eduardo Lacerda. He said it was all part of an experiment, a study on perception, control, and narrative. That the crimes were real, but the contexts were created to test how far the truth could be manipulated. And that I, by following the clues, had proven that the system worked. The letter ended with a disturbing sentence. You are now part of the story. Keep writing. Before I could react, the projector turned off by itself. The warehouse fell silent. There was no sign of Eduardo, no cameras, no trace. It was as if he had never been there. But the letter was real, and with it, the certainty that the game wasn't over. Maybe he was preparing me for something bigger, something that hadn't yet begun, or that was already underway without me realizing it. I returned home with the feeling that everything had changed. There was no prison, no confrontation, no definitive answers. Just a new question. What if the real objective was never to solve the crimes, but to transform me into someone capable of creating them? Because when the mystery becomes part of who you are, the outcome isn't the end. It's the beginning of a new investigation. And I was ready. After everything I've been through, one question still echoes in my mind. Do we really have control over what happens around us? Or are we just pieces on a larger chessboard, moved by invisible hands? The newspaper case showed me that the line between free will and manipulation is thinner than it seems. And that, sometimes, what we call choice is just a response to what has already been written. I started looking at people with different eyes. Every gesture, every decision, every silence, everything seemed to carry a weight I had previously ignored. What if someone, somewhere, was observing all of this, cataloging, predicting, adjusting? The idea that our lives can be read like headlines scares me, but it also fascinates me. Because deep down, we are all narratives under construction. The newspaper, which was once just paper and ink, has become a symbol of something greater. A distorted mirror of reality, where each news item can be a clue, each silence a message. And I, who always sought answers in the facts, now find myself searching for meaning between the lines. Perhaps the true mystery lies not in the crimes, but in the way we choose to perceive them. And that's why I continue. Because as long as there are questions, there will be stories. And as long as there are stories, there will be someone trying to decipher them. The newspaper case isn't over, it's just changed form. And I remain vigilant, because the next enigma may be on its way. Perhaps it's already printed. Perhaps it's already being read. Perhaps by you. The next morning, while I was drinking my now cold coffee, I heard the sound of paper being slid under the door. It was a new newspaper, but it wasn't the City Courier. The layout was different, the paper rougher, and the headline. Well, the headline read, "The next enigma begins now." There was no date, no price, no publisher. Just a sequence of symbols at the bottom, and a familiar feeling that everything was starting again. I cautiously opened the newspaper. The articles seemed normal, but there was something strange about the images. Each photo showed a figure in the background, always the same silhouette, always at the same angle, as if someone were subtly inserting themselves into the narrative. Clara analyzed the symbols and said they were coordinates. And when we cross-referenced the data, we discovered they pointed to a neighboring city. A new setting? The idea that the game was expanding unsettled me. It was no longer about an isolated case. It was about a network, a sequence, perhaps even a larger organization than we imagined. What if the previous newspaper was just the prologue? What if everything we'd experienced so far was only the beginning of something more complex, deeper, more dangerous? I knew I couldn't ignore this new calling. I took a deep breath, grabbed my notebook, and started writing. Because when mystery knocks on the door, you don't ask if it's safe, you open it. And now, with a new newspaper in hand and a new city on the horizon, I knew the next investigation was already underway. The question is, are you coming with me? After everything that happened, one thing became clear to me. What seems absurd isn't always false. Sometimes, what defies logic is precisely what reveals the truth. The newspaper case taught me that reality can be manipulated, distorted, written, and rewritten, and that we, the readers, are an active part of this construction. The question is, are we reading? Or are we being read? Each clue I found led me to a new level of awareness, not just about the crimes, but about how we see the world. What we choose to ignore, what we let pass, what we accept as normal. And if there's someone behind the curtains pulling the strings, maybe it's time to turn on the lights. Because true power isn't in knowing everything, it's in knowing where to look. This investigation transformed me. It made me question what is control, what is chance, and what is destiny. And perhaps, more important than finding answers, is learning to ask the right questions. Because when you start investigating the world around you, you discover that the greatest mysteries aren't in the crimes. They're in the choices we make every day. If this story made you think, share with me in the comments. What would you do if you found a hidden message in tomorrow's newspaper? And, of course, if you want to keep up with my investigations, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Because the next case might be closer than you think.